Hi everyone, so I have thought long and hard about how I could potentially beat that intro from last time. I've considered so many things. I've considered burning myself with an open flame. I've considered using a deodorant can as a flamethrower. I've considered running through more cardboard boxes for your own viewing pleasure. Just gotta accept it. I can't. So here is something completely different. This week we're looking at Spyro. Spyro the Dragon is another one of those characters that I adored as a child, but for some reason never ended up spending much time with. It was one of those games I'd watch a friend play rather than playing through myself. Young me really enjoyed a live action let's play, but regardless, the Spyro games always stood out to me and the character definitely burned a memorable hole in my heart. As I aged and went through game shops over the years, I'd always make sure to look at the characters' games to see what was occurring, never paying too much attention, but always noticing slight differences if they did arise. Like all other good 3D platformers, Spyro's main strength was that of his strong character design, and this was carefully developed. However, initial sketches of the character were not what I expected. They were much more fitting of what you might expect from a cartoon-inspired traditional dragon. Many of these designs were bulkier and frankly, uglier than what the finished concept would end up as. Spyro was intended to be a mascot that would appeal to all, with a bratty character to boot, but these traditional dragons that stood on two legs didn't emphasise these traits quite enough at this early stage. At one point, the character was a green dragon named Pete. How original. Disney says hello, here is my cease and desist. Can you imagine if this had happened? Disney would have come after them quicker than they took down gifts of Baby Yoda. Thankfully, the team saw sense and developed a character that was visually more appealing and far more unique. Purple scales were decided upon as many of the locales would be lush and green. As similarly mentioned with Crash Bandicoot, it was essential that this character was visible against the game's environments. Speaking of Crash, him and Spyro do seem to share quite a lot of similar traits and historical moments. They both tried to establish themselves as the PlayStation mascot, they both struggled after they left the platform, and they both have had triumphant hurrahs in the modern day. Given their history, I may bring up Crash a few times in this video too. It just feels right. Is that a good enough excuse to reuse this clip again? Also, just like the last episode, I've got another Tubbs figurine to give away. Thanks to all who entered for the Crash Bandicoot Duck last time around, but this time I have a Spyro up for grabs. Yet again, a big thanks to Numbskull Designs for providing this figurine, which is layered with little details that make this feel like a very authentic recreation of the little dragon. If you'd like to enter, head on over to my Twitter for full details. As always, we'll go through a ton of designs today, so let me know what you think in the comments section below. I'm the artist Mark Flynn, and let's find out which Spyro design I think truly is best. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to help me on my quest for 20,000 subscribers. We edge a little bit closer each day. Spyro soared onto the PlayStation in 1998 and then again in 1999 and 2000, with 3 3D platform games that would position him as a memorable platforming staple of this era. Of course, this game established his key features and the promotional artwork used a 3D render of Spyro to highlight his standout character traits. Among these were his previously mentioned purple skin and scales, which were complemented by his striped yellow underbelly, hair, horns, and bat-like wingspan. He was yet again a character with fierce brow definition protruding from his perfectly round head. Carl Pilkington, is that you? But yeah, just enough stocky cuteness to make you not feel guilty about burning these poor innocent sheep. I love this initial design for Spyro. He looked confident and smug from the get-go on this box art, and his character really shines through. In a classic case of these PS1 games not aging quite as well as they could, the game itself shows off a blocky and somewhat cruder version of this render with Spyro's character model. For this time, this was a massively impressive 3D platforming feat, and it's certainly not without its charm. Spyro still included some impressive features and textures, though a majority of his shapes were made up of lines and polygons as opposed to his smooth box art. Similar to Crash Bandicoot's second and third iterations on the same console, Spyro would go through similar subtle improvements in the follow-up PS1 titles, with his character model becoming ever so slightly more developed. While these aren't massively noticeable, the improvements to his wings can be clearly seen, as these now move away from the angular shapes in the original and closer resemble the bat-like wingspan from his artwork. While graphically these games haven't aged the nicest, especially when you compare the cutscenes cutscenes to a game like Crash, Spyro was off to an instant hot-fire start, and the character launched a very successful series with a very strong initial design. Little did we know just how much we'd be seeing of this character in this iteration. Funnily enough, again similar to that Orange Bandicoot, Spyro received an overhaul for the game's release in Japan. There's a crazy amount of parallels here. Whilst retaining a look very similar to the 3D render across the rest of the world, Japanese Spyro was much cuter, all of his angular shapes were smoothed out and rounded, and he looked much more like a baby dragon than an edgy teen. The series actually didn't do too great in Japan, and they didn't take to this character. Spyro 2 released to relatively apathetic audiences, and 3 didn't even release. A mainline entry in the series wouldn't come to Japan until 2019, this time without changes. The only other Spyro games to release in Japan were on the Game Boy Advance, and wow, they used a heavily modified version of Spyro who used a completely different design. I had no idea about this one. This retains some of his traits like the belly, tail and horns, but completely changes up his tone. It now looks more like a shade of blue, which is offset against a bold orange, and Spyro even appears to have longer fringe-like hair. So trendy. We'll talk more about the Game Boy Advance later on, but this is a really cool detour for the Spyro design. Across his entry into the next generation of platforms, Spyro didn't change up much, taking his classic design onto the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. This started with 2002's Enter the Dragonfly, which presented the same old Spyro with matching artwork and a much improved character model. This time around, the details of the dragon were much clearer, and the new graphical capabilities of the consoles lent themselves well to this design. Spyro was much smoother than before, and everything looked much more appealing than the previous generation. In 2004, A Hero's Tale continued the series and made a few tweaks to the design for once. This model was more expressive and stylized, with an even stockier body. Look at the cute chonky boy. No update came for the game's artwork however, which maintained the same style yet again, though the use of it on box art had become slightly more creative at least. Between 2001 and 2004, 4 Spyro titles would release for the Game Boy Advance. 2001's Season of Ice, 2002's Season of Flame, 2003's Attack of the Rhinox, also known as Adventure in some regions for accuracy's sake, and Spyro Orange, The Cortex Conspiracy, a partner title to Crash Bandicoot Purple as mentioned in the previous episode. Okay, I promise to stop mentioning Crash now. The initial 3 titles were similar to Crash's first entries on the same platform. God damn it. These titles were isometric platform collectathons that emulated the style of the original PlayStation trilogy somewhat, with a 2D sprite that did its best to look 3-dimensional. Season of Ice and Season of Flame used the exact same sprite, with Attack of the Rhinox using a very similar repurposed sprite too, given that they wanted to continue the 3D platforming style that Spyro was famous for. As much as I love the classic pixel art style Spyro from the cutscene dialogue boxes, this Spyro works best on the GBA for me. Spyro Orange was the first title to use a different sprite, and due to the side-scrolling 2D nature of the title, I guess the isometric Spyro just wasn't able to be repurposed this time around. I must say it's actually been very interesting seeing how commonly models and sprites have been repurposed in classic games like these, given the recent Pokemon drama. This Spyro still used a pseudo 3D style sprite, a look perhaps best established in Donkey Kong Country, but I don't think this game necessarily pulls it off too well. It's clearly Spyro you're playing as, but it's a bit of a hideous title if I'm completely honest. As is tradition, across all of the Game Boy titles, Spyro used the same classic render. By the end of 2004, Spyro had used this style of render for a solid half a decade. That artist got his money's worth. It's a testament to how well this initial design had been received, but also demonstrated a clear apprehension or refusal to update the character in a meaningful way. Purple would be the last appearance of the character in this style, outside of a few mobile titles that reused the GBA graphics of course. Interest in the character had begun to dwindle by this point in time, and it was clear the character needed some updating by this point, but it wasn't coming just yet. The next release, Shadow Legacy, came to the Nintendo DS in 2005. For the first time, the Spyro on this box art wasn't the same 3D render from the past. Mind blown. What big changes were there, you're probably thinking? There aren't any. Moving away from the 3D render style in favour of a more stylised bit of artwork, this is a very similar Spyro indeed, in a very different style. The artwork makes him look far bulkier and his wingspan has been notably modified, though both of these are likely heightened by the different style of pose the game art opted to have him in this time around. In the game itself, Spyro used a polygon based model yet again, and it's almost as if the PS1 and GBA titles had a baby. It's a much more detailed attempt at this style of graphics and does a better job of making Spyro look like a stocky and charming character. At the same time, it's still so small that at a glance, it's hard to notice that many changes. Unless you spend hours analysing them, of course. But who would waste their time doing that? Compared to previous designs in this style, the character's proportions are slightly different, with Spyro's head and horns being noticeably bigger. He's very similar actually to the Spyro from Hero's Tale. Wait, he is the Spyro from Hero's Tale. You can see how easy it can be to confuse the character given these minuscule changes. I'm not a huge fan of how a lot of DS games have aged look-wise, and the general look of this game doesn't appeal to me on that broad of a scale. But what about you? Is there anyone out there that loves this Spyro look? I really like the modifications made to Spyro's initial design for the purposes of the box art, however subtle they might have been, and thought the game did a good job of presenting this stocky boy. It was around this time that Spyro as a franchise had really begun to take a significant dive in terms of popularity, so a few changes were made in order to try and bring the dragon up to speed with other franchises from the mid-noughties. It was time to get edgy, baby. The Legend of Spyro series launched in 2006 with a new beginning coming to the PlayStation 2, Xbox and Nintendo Wii. This was a reboot of the Spyro series with a much more serious take on the previous material, and of course a new epic series decidedly wanted to move away from the previous design. Is easily the biggest difference to Spyro so far. For starters, his snout is now much more prominent, almost like a crocodile. His horns are less spiky, more angular, and feature large round details from the bottom to the top. The scales on his head are now separate as opposed to attached, and his eyes are much more bulbous and noticeable in a weird, creepy kind of way. Just for clarification. When playing through levels and seeing the main camera angle, I think this design looks pretty nice, but the face is where I draw a few issues. Spyro's always been a slightly goofy looking character, but this new face of his feels like a bit of a botched surgery revamp if I'm honest. I hope the dragon didn't pay for it himself. His mouth is so wide and his face feels like it's trying to escape from his head. I'm not too sure why they thought this was necessarily better than the previous design they had. The box art presented this in a more stylised look. His form looks much more cutesy here, with his snout by comparison being significantly smaller. Dat ugly crocodile nose though. The second game in the series would also present the character in a similar way, with more box art showing off Spyro's very angular shape with the in-game model looking almost identical. In 2008 however, we had our first entry into HD consoles, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. And at this time, Spyro's adventure game came to its close, and to make the most of the new exciting consoles, what did Spyro do? He hit puberty, like a ton of bricks. Dawn of the Dragon operated on a time skip, and aged Spyro for the first time ever. Epic! He was a teenager with a similar form to his previous look, but with a noticeable number of changes. For starters, his face sorted itself out a bit. It looked less like a crocodile jumping out at you or a botched dinoplasty, and has been shrunk down and smoothed out ever so slightly. His wingspan has instead grown twofold, his body is longer, and his upper half is more muscular than his back half. He looks a bit rougher around the edges, with the extra spike here and there, and looks like a much more mature take on the character, and much more like a traditional dragon. I actually think this design is the best from this trilogy. It made sense to reboot this series with a new design, and given the dark and serious nature of these games, this look is a fitting change for the character. The original design was also just a little bit too goofy. This series also had GBA and DS versions too, but much like the previously mentioned games from the original series, these kind of just scale down this iteration into less impressive formats. Again though, pretty fond of this pixel art. I find it much more expressive than the somewhat goofy accompanying original 3D model. Even including the Legend of Spyro games, changes to the character have always remained pretty subtle for the most part. However, after this series concluded and the character took a 3-year break, he returned in 2011 with a brand new franchise, and oh boy, he sure had been hit with the ugly stick. Or hit in the face with a mallet. I mentioned the Skylanders series in my previous episode, but what I didn't mention is this series was actually launched with Spyro as the lead character. This was a huge departure looks-wise, as Spyro generally looks like a very different beast. Angry fans didn't take this too well, that sounds familiar, and compared him to a gargoyle. Personally, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think he looks a bit more feral and lizard-like. Illuminati confirmed. Regardless, this iteration kept the larger wingspan, flattened his face, littered him with scales, changed up his eye colour, added emphasis and bulkiness to features like his tail and horns, and made the character stylistically look less cutesy and more aggressive. In the game at least. The artwork surrounding the game was much softer, and though it still doesn't look like the character evolved, it's a lot less harsh on the eyes. Seriously though, I don't hate this design as it stands by itself. In its own right, I actually quite like it, especially the concept art. I think some of that is really great, but I don't really like it as a design for Spyro. If the character wasn't purple, and there weren't the words Spyro's Adventure in the title spelling out whose game this was, you could quite easily miss him at a first glance. I'm almost sure they would have been slightly concerned people might not recognise the character when they released this. I know I was confused when I saw this in game, it definitely wasn't the Spyro I remembered fondly. It should be pointed out that as this series developed and more games and TV shows arrived with it, the character design did become more well-rounded. His nasty scales were scaled down in the games, as well as the harsh definition of his facial features and teeth, and his general textures did look better over time. The TV show had probably the best look of the lot, with a much smoother design which was even pretty cute on occasion. I think they were aware of the backlash against this design and opted to make future inclusions such as Crash far more faithful by comparison. Crash? Who let you back in? Following up this series was a 2019 release that was no doubt inspired by the previous remaster of the Crash Bandicoot franchise. A point for every time I've mentioned Crash today. You win nothing. Spyro made his way onto current consoles and eventually the PC. Yeah boy. With the Spyro Reignited trilogy, a collection of remakes of the original PlayStation games. This Spyro feels like a good mixture of the Spyro from Spyro 2 and the Spyro who had just left the PS1 combined, with a mixture of modern aesthetically pleasing touches. He's brighter and bolder than the original design, using a much more colourful palette. His features are also larger and more detailed, such as his tail with clear swirly specifics, and his horns and chest are significant in scale. His wings have differed in appearance over years, with some original artwork presenting them as yellow and purple, with the original game presenting them as a very dark shade of orange. Here they match the colours of his horns and the tip of his tail, making for a cleaner mixture of the two colours. As well as this, they tuck away a lot easier and aren't always looking spread like a bat's. His upper body is slightly more muscular, not to the scale of the Legend of Spyro's third entry, but definitely more so than classic Spyro. And while his face still has strong features, the different rendering style makes his appear far much more natural. Depending on the lighting of the scenes too, he may appear to be a lighter or bolder shade of purple. These may seem like minute details, but they do a lot for the character when it comes to emoting. He's never seemed more confident, cocky or bratty for that matter. It's an absolutely beautiful design that really does do the character a strong service in both its game model and the very similar game artwork. And that's it, the character largely hasn't changed things up too much over his years, but all things considered and from what we've seen, I think that is probably for the best. Speaking of best, what's his best design? Well, I'm really not going to drag on with this one. Kill me. Reignited Trilogy Spyro is the clear winner to me, and for one of the first times ever, I have to say that I think this is an easy pick. This whole remaster adds a level of character to the original titles that was never there before, removing the need to imagine a world over the top of so many reused assets. The game presents the most likeable Spyro who simultaneously was the most visually striking, charming, and pleasant to look at. His new artwork is incredibly appealing and masterfully crafted, but the character model is where I think this character truly shines. Last time I mentioned him now seriously, but the Crash Bandicoot remasters highlighted in many ways that Crash didn't actually need a reboot. His original design holds up very well, as does the game's cutscenes and any time the character expresses himself. The Spyro games really don't hold up as well. The character has lots of quirks, sure, but unlike Crash, he has actual dialogue. It's his responsibility to carry the story along, and the new and improved graphic style simply makes the game and the character by association so much more likeable. The original design was a tremendous one that really didn't need anything done to it other than some modernisation, and that's exactly what they did. This is the perfect Spyro design in my eyes. So that's it from me, but what do you think? If you disagree, let me know in the comments section below. Alternatively, hop on over to my Discord. We're a small community that chat about games, each other's artwork, wrestling, and a bunch of other stuff. You may even be able to get some feedback if you're an aspiring content creator on YouTube. At this time, I'd like to give a big shout out to my patrons who make videos like this possible, with a special thank you going out to Top Hat Gaming Man and Dingus Slade, who are donating at the top tier of donations. Thanks very much. I'd also like to thank those that donated to me on Ko-fi this month. It's super appreciated. If you'd like extra perks, like early access to my character design videos and a credit in each episode, head on over to my Patreon for more information. Alternatively, if you'd just like to tip me as a one-off because you enjoyed this video, please do so on Ko-fi. Any amount is appreciated, and even a single US dollar or British pound would help me continue to make videos like this one. Thanks for watching. I need to make these easier to read because I cannot read and it is frustrating. I've also just got to add that from playing these games, Hunter is probably one of the funniest and ugly looking characters I've ever seen in a video game. Genuinely. I think this opening Spyro 2 cutscene is way too iconic purely based on how ridiculous it looks in the modern day. But the remaster has since come around and he still somehow looks equally disturbing. Just what did Ripto do to you, man? I'm not actually sure if I want to know. Look at those eyes. What is going on in there? Speaking of Ripto, Jesus Christ. Burn it. But he had just enough stocky cuteness to make you feel... But he had just enough stocky cute... Blech. Blech. But he had just enough stocky cuteness to make you not feel guilty about burning those poor innocent... But he had just enough stocky cuteness to make you not feel guilty about burning these poor innocent... Jesus Christ. But he had just enough stocky cuteness to make you not feel guilty about perning. Why can't I read? Before I recorded this, I ate so many Doritos and my throat now hates me.